The deputy chief of Russia's military intelligence has been shot and seriously wounded in Moscow. It's the latest in a series of attacks on high-ranking military officers. Russia's foreign minister has described the shooting as an apparent terrorist act by Ukraine aimed at derailing peace talks. There's been no comment so far from Kyiv.
Behind the doors of this residential building in Moscow, a senior Russian general was shot several times. Investigators say an unidentified attacker opened fire and then fled the scene. Neighbors woke up hearing gunshots and screams for help.
I heard several shots as far as I can remember. It woke me up. Yes, several shots. A neighbor screamed for help and she called the police. Then other neighbors rushed out too. They asked how they could help. Should they call an ambulance and police? But she had already done that.
The deputy chief of Russia's military intelligence, Lieutenant General Vladimir Alexeyev, has been central to Russia's war effort, from intelligence coordination to negotiating during the Wagner mutiny in 2023. The incident is being treated as an apparent assassination attempt, and Moscow is already pointing fingers at Kyiv.
This terrorist act has once again confirmed the focus of Zelensky's regime on constant provocations aimed at disrupting the negotiation process.
Alexeyev is the latest Russian military figure to be targeted. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, several top-ranked officers have been assassinated. His shooting raises new questions about security at the highest levels of Russia's defense establishment.
Over to our correspondent Viktorija Terentjeva in Riga, from where DW has been operating since Russia shut down our Moscow bureau. What more can you tell us about this general and the attack?
So, Lieutenant General Alexeyev was indeed a top figure among the Russian officers responsible for providing the intelligence data on Ukraine before invasion in 2022. And he was shot today in Moscow in the residential building today in the morning at 7 a.m. when he was leaving his apartment to go to work, when at that moment he encountered a person that shot him twice in a leg and an arm, and while trying to fight the attacker, the general was shot third time in the chest. What we know now that he is in the hospital in critical condition. Some media report that he is in a coma. Russian media also report that the authorities claim that they possess the photograph and video footage of the attacker. Some ideas also exist that that could have been a woman. It's interesting that some Russian media also quote the so-called residential chats where the people who are living in this building are sharing their piece of information, and one of those pieces is that the cameras in the building were not working at the moment of the attack. And just to quote what is being said about the building, the complex has been described as a quote-unquote pass-through yard with people freely coming and going, and that's the situation with the general for this moment.
The Kremlin is pointing the finger at Kyiv. What evidence is there?
Nobody has taken the responsibility yet from the Ukrainian side, but indeed the shooting on Friday continues a string of attacks and assassinations of highly ranking military officers from Russia in Moscow, many of which have been blamed on Ukraine, and some of them was really claimed responsibility from the Ukrainian side. Just to remind you that just over 1 month ago, another high-ranking Russian military official, Lieutenant General Nil Sarvarov, was killed by a bomb exploded under his car. In April, another Lieutenant General, Yaroslav Moskalik, was also killed in a bomb accident, which Kremlin accused Ukraine of orchestrating. And going back to 2024, Ukraine security services, as I mentioned, they claimed responsibility indeed for killing the head of Russia's chemical, radiological and biological weapons unit, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who was killed also by a bomb placed on an electric scooter parked nearby his apartment building. And it's important to mention that Igor Kirillov was one of the most prominent Russian generals to have been targeted, because also US and UK sources have been informing and saying that he was a part of the unit partly responsible for the chemicals used on the battlefield in Ukraine, which is prohibited.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. DW's Viktorija Terentjeva in Riga. Thank you very much for the analysis.
Well, I'm joined now by Domitilla Sagramoso. She's an expert on Russian foreign and security policy at King's College London. Domitilla, it's good to see you again. Good to have you on the program. What do you think made Lieutenant General Vladimir Alexeyev an assassination target?
Well, I mean, he's a very high position within the GRU, which is Russia's military intelligence, and as such, he became involved in many sort of operations abroad, primarily more recently now in Ukraine. But he's also been involved in sort of operations, for example, in Syria. Apparently, he was also part of the organization of the Skripal poisoning here in the United Kingdom. But what is interesting about him is that he was born in Ukraine. And although he works for Russia, you know, he's seen, of course, by Ukrainians as in many ways as a traitor. And what is very interesting is that he has been involved in the surrender of fighters of the Azov battalion in Mariupol in 2022. And there's been a note by one of the leaders of these battalions saying that Alexeyev had been a traitor because he hadn't really kept his word in terms of treating the prisoners that were captured in Mariupol in a humane manner, and that he had not respected what had been agreed, and he had not respected the Geneva Conventions, that many of these prisoners had been very mistreated, without being given the proper medical care. They had been tortured. And it sounds like, this could be potentially revenge from colleagues, from the Azov battalion. So that is one line of thinking. But I mean, we're not sure.
Do you think that could be a possible explanation for why Russia is pointing the finger at Ukraine?
I think so. I think that, having said that, Russia tends to blame so many things on Ukraine when they're not really true, so it's a bit like their usual line of reasoning. I mean, they are, accusing Ukraine of a killing of one person. And as we know, in the last few weeks, they've basically left entire cities without heating, light, electricity, and water. So if we compare sort of the damage that the Russians have been doing, it's so much massive. But of course, they tend to blame it all on Ukrainians, and this is a bit early to say. What is interesting is that the Ukrainians, sometimes they have conceded the fact that they have engaged in these kind of targeted operations. But generally, they've been conducted, so for example, with explosives, although there have been also targeted killings, with shootings.
What do you make of the timing of this attack? I mean, talks between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States have just concluded, and these talks were called by both sides constructive.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't build a direct connection. What is interesting is that the head of the GRU is part of these negotiating teams on the Russian side. So, the head of the GRU has been negotiating with the Ukrainian delegation, discussing very specific questions around, how to implement a ceasefire and the details from the primarily sort of military point of view of how this could be carried out. So I would find it very strange that the Ukrainians, who seem to be eager at least to reach agreement on certain points, especially on the question of how to monitor a potential ceasefire along the line of confrontation, that they would be shooting at someone, within this same structure, unless they want to send a very clear, sort of targeted message. But
Yeah.
I'm not so sure of that. I mean, that would be a bit of a lot of speculation on my side. I'm not sure of that.
Domitilla Sagramoso from King's College London. As always, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.